Hello, everyone. Good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here to introduce Dr. Aaron Bryant to you. Myself, Alaka Narayanan. I'm here from Calicut itself. So, Dr. Bryant currently works as a curator of photography, visual anthropology, and contemporary history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. His projects often delve into how communities find meaning, resilience, and identity in the face of historical and social change. Through his work, he's not documenting history but inspiring conversations about where we are and where we are headed to. He has extensively studied and curated exhibitions related to the civil rights movement, the Poor People's Campaign, and he has earned his doctorate from the University of Maryland, where he received the Body Voice Award for his research on the Poor People's Campaign. In 2018, Dr. Bryant curated the exhibition City of Hope, Resurrection City, and the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, which commemorated the 50th anniversary of the campaign envisioned by Dr. Martin Luther King. This exhibition highlighted the significance of the campaign in the addressing poverty as a national human rights issue. Dr. Bryant emphasizes the importance of visual culture in understanding social movements. He has noted connections between photographs from the civil rights era and images from recent movements like Black Lives Matter, underscoring the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Through his work, Dr. Bryant sheds light on the historical and contemporary significance of movements advocating for racial economic justice, illustrating their impact on American society. So it's my honor to invite Dr. Bryant onto the stage. So he'll be talking for about 15 to 20 minutes and we'll open the stage for discussion. So over to you, sir.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, everyone. I'm so glad to see folks out here in the audience, particularly this early in the morning. And this is such a great festival. I just can't believe all the energy and activity that is already out here. And I really appreciate your taking time to come hear me speak. I would like to thank the U.S. Consulate, who has actually brought me here, as well as my exhibition, City of Hope, which opened in Chennai, and it's going to be traveling to 4 other cities, Mumbai, Delhi, Calcutta, and Hyderabad. So if you get a chance to see the exhibition, I encourage you to do that. And I would also like to thank the Meridian International Center and the Smithsonian Institution, 2 other organizations that partner with the U.S. Consulate to make both the exhibition and my travel here available. So I guess what I would like to do today is to read to you something that was early on in my career, just as I was working on my research for the Poor People's Campaign during my doctoral studies. There was a conference at Cambridge on South Asian histories, visual culture and South Asian histories. And that's when I began to really dive into this notion of King and the Poor People's Campaign and how it was very much influenced by King's trip to India in 1959. And so out of that conference, I was able to write a book chapter that was included in a book published by the organizers of that conference on visual culture and South Asian histories. And so I'll just read you an excerpt on that. And are we able to pull up the photograph that I'll be referring to? Mm-hmm. In the meantime, I'll just go ahead and get started. So my interest, not just in the Poor People's Campaign, but my interest in this relationship between Martin Luther King Jr., his move towards human rights and economic justice movements begins really when I realized, in looking at this one particular photo by a photographer, Bob Fitch, in which he captures King in an office with a desk, and behind King is a photograph of Gandhi. And once I started doing research on this photograph, I actually had the opportunity to reach out to the photographer who has since passed away. But he explained to me why it was important for them to take that photograph and why he and Martin Luther King Jr. Made the decision to use a photograph of Gandhi. Now, what's really interesting about that is in African American culture, particularly of a certain generation, like my grandmother's generation, it wasn't uncommon when you go into a home that there would be a photograph of Jesus Christ, somewhere in the home. And so in this photograph, you would expect, especially since Martin Luther King Jr. was a Christian minister, that he would have a photograph of Jesus Christ. Instead, he made the decision to use an image of Gandhi instead to make a statement about the whole idea of peace, justice, and humanity and love as powerful forces in the world. And so that's how it all began for me, sort of asking questions. Why did he use this photograph of Gandhi rather than an image of Jesus Christ? So I'll just read you the excerpt from the chapter. Born in Los Angeles, California, Bob Fitch was a self-taught photographer who was known primarily for his social justice images of the 1960s and early 1970s. Fitch captured iconic photographs of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers Movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, as well as Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union. He is quoted as once saying, "Photojournalism seduced me. It was my way to support the organizing for social justice that was transforming history and our lives and future." Fitch's father was an ordained minister with the United Church of Christ, a professor of Christian ethics and dean at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The school historically focused on a social gospel theology of social justice and change. After earning his undergraduate degree in psychology, Fitch later earned bachelor's and master's degrees in divinity from Pacific, and like his father, became an ordained minister for the United Church of Christ in 1965. Influenced by the writings of James Baldwin and folk musician Pete Seeger, Bob Fitch began photographing while working for the Glide Memorial United Methodist Church in San Francisco, where he worked with gangs, the homeless, and LGBTQ communities. He was also a labor organizer and draft resistance counselor, and later worked for the California Department of Housing and the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz. Bob Fitch later volunteered with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where he eventually became the organization's photographer. And this is where he met Martin Luther King. As Dr. King's official photographer, Bob Fitch captured the movement from behind the scenes, including its meetings and intimate moments inside the King family home. Additionally, Coretta Scott King asked Fitch to photograph Dr. King's funeral after Dr. King's assassination. Fitch's work would inspire generations, from the National King Memorial in Washington, D.C., to postal stamps. Unlike other well-known photographers of the Civil Rights Movement, Bob Fitch captured personal photographs of private moments as both a participant and an observer of the movement. In 1966, Fitch captured this iconic and perhaps controversial image of Martin Luther King Jr. In the photo, King stands in an office behind a metal desk. He wears the conventional dark trousers and blazer of a Baptist minister with a white shirt and dark tie. All are tucked neatly behind a sweater or vest as King stares away from the camera in a direction that is distant from the viewer's left shoulder. The civil rights leader holds a pen in his right hand and folds his arms loosely across his chest. His stance suggests listening, contemplation, or preparation for a response of some kind as he hovers above a pad and papers that sit on top of a desk. The desk is manageably cluttered. It holds an assortment of folders, documents, a journal or digest, a Rolodex, a rotary phone. The phone is the multi-line kind that commonly occupied busy offices in the 1960s. It sits in front of the Rolodex that offers easy access to important networks of resources. Several books are visible, with 3 titles overtly positioned to be more discernible to viewers. The first title, Five Smooth Stones, refers to the biblical story of David and Goliath. The book's narrative is an interracial love story set against the backdrop of the civil rights era. The second book has Sloan printed on the spine. It is uncertain to which author the title of the book refers, but perhaps this is a publication by Irving J. Sloan, who authored The American Negro, a chronology and fact book. The third book is Stranger at the Gates, a memoir that focuses on the mostly young northern white college students of the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. Activist Fannie Lou Hamer wrote the book's foreword with the assertion that 90% of the Negro people in Mississippi have gone to church all their lives. They have lived with the hope that if they kept standing up in a Christian manner, things would change. After we found out that Christian love alone wouldn't cure the sickness in Mississippi, Hamer continued, then we knew we had other things to do. Each publication gives insight into King's thinking at the time the photo was taken, as he contemplated civil rights beyond the borders of age, race, and geography. Emblematic of King's position as a philosopher and a nation's moral conscience, the photograph suggests the minister has been caught in a moment of reflection while contemplating ideas for an essay, speech, or sermon. The office walls are bare. They are stark except for an image of Gandhi that hangs in the direction of King's right shoulder. Only the subtle play and gradation of light and shadow disrupt the solemnity shaped by the background's plane. This is intentional. The position of Gandhi's portrait within the photograph's composition manipulates the viewer's eye as one focuses their shift between the photographer's primary subjects, Gandhi and King, from King to Gandhi, then back again. The eye moves through a visual strategy that centers the two men against the wall's white space. This was the image's controversy for some conservatives. Fitch and King presented Dr. King as a Christian minister, but they pushed the envelope to go against the grain of conservative thought and traditions. Rather than following the tradition of photographing Dr. King with an image of Jesus Christ, as would be expected of a Christian minister, they chose to photograph Dr. King with an image of Gandhi. For many conservatives, this might have been a controversial or provocative choice, if not blasphemous to certain sectors of America's religious community. Dr. King argued, however, that Gandhi was one of the few people in modern times to practice the principles of love and peace as expected and lived by Christ. Gandhi transformed the ethics of love, according to King, into a power for morally based social and political change. Now, the Montgomery bus boycott put Martin Luther King Jr. on a global map, and although he was recognized and celebrated in different parts of the world, the Montgomery bus boycott was still just a local crusade and not a global movement. Dr. King was a grassroots organizer, and it would be several years before he would lead national campaigns on the scale of India's independence movement. Protest models offered by Indian activists therefore left an impression on the civil rights leader that extended beyond his eventual visit to India in 1959. Dr. King viewed global communities as part of a universal culture that required ideological shifts if humanity were to survive. In The Vision of a World Made New, one of King's first speeches as a minister in 1954, he addressed the need to replace a fading old global culture with an emerging new world order. On a world scale, Dr. King wrote, we have seen the old order in the form of colonialism and imperialism. This leads to domination and exploitation. So already early in his career in 1954, Dr. King is thinking about the impact that colonialism and imperialism is having on people of culture throughout the world. He's just recently become a minister, and he hasn't even led his first movement. So King saw India under British rule and often turned to this as a model, as an example to compare colonialism in other parts of the world to segregation and discrimination in the US. This particular speech reveals King's awareness of global inequalities as he drew connections between race, class, and systems of oppression worldwide. It also demonstrates how early on global oppression was part of King's consciousness even before his first protest. According to Lewis Baldwin, who's a historian who is focused on King, and I quote, he had become fully convinced that the struggles of people in Africa and Asia against Western imperialism and colonialism could not be separated from his own people's plight under Jim Crow in the United States. And so that's really where it all begins for me, when I begin to look at how does India's independence movement, Gandhi, and the ideas of colonialism and imperialism begin to inform Dr. King, even as he's a student and before he becomes a minister. And if you look at his writings, his early speeches, his early writings, he talks a lot about these ideas. So we may see that the civil rights movement in the United States, particularly those movements that were led by Dr. King, we may not understand on the surface how they connect to what was happening in India so many decades before, and how the movement against oppression in India, against colonialism and imperialism in India really did inform much of the work and much of the philosophy for Dr. King. I could go on, but if you wanted to open the floor, we could. Well, but one of the things about me as a speaker is I'm often more interested in engaging folks in a conversation. It would be really easy for me to sit here and talk and even just kind of recite to you the exhibition script, which I know is sort of backwards and forward, but I'm always interested in engaging people in a conversation. So I really hope that you all have comments to make, and not just for me, not just questions for me or comments for me, but maybe we can make this a dialogue between all of us, because I would like to know what other people might think in terms of responses as well. So I don't know how we're going to do that, and maybe I've put you on the spot here, but we should probably get a microphone out there to the audience so that they can participate in this as well.
Before we move on to the discussion session, I'll ask you some questions. It's not like questions, it's some opinions. So the title of our session is They Had a Dream. They are Gandhi and King. So they all had a dream, which was in a collective sense. They wanted a society to change, they wanted the world to change. But as we see nowadays, we all are having individual dreams, or dreams are subjective these days. So what do you think? Is it a limitation of our education system, or what do you think about that?
Well, that is a tough question, actually. Now, I would say in terms of understanding social movements and how you would analyze social movements, it really is taking a look at how do you build a sense of community. So building a sense of community around a common cause was really important during the civil rights movement. It was also, of course, extremely important during India's fight for independence in the early 20th century. And so what's happening now is we're sort of like living these very disparate lives. And to your point, we all have disparate dreams. But what are the dreams that we have in common? What are the dreams that pull us together as a community or as individual communities? And then how do you bring those communities together to talk about what those dreams are and how we can make those dreams a reality? And really, the civil rights movement in the US, that's how it all began. It began with conversations in places of worship, conversations in beauty salons and restaurants, and where people gathered in public spheres like this beach. And out of those conversations, small steps were taken to create communities, and the communities grew. They got larger and larger. Over the world with very different ideas about what their lives were and how they saw themselves in the world. But through building online communities, they were able to manifest a movement in different parts of the world all at the same time. It was absolutely incredible to see. So I think there's a way, it's very different nowadays than it was during Dr. King's time when you would knock on doors. But we have advantages here with social media to be able to create these virtual communities where people can get engaged in conversations with one another about how they would like to see change and progress to help the greater good.
Thank you, sir. So, another question is that we have all the resources and all the really good education these days, but aren't we really moving away from what they have wanted us to be? Or like the Citizenship Amendment Bill that was passed in India and nowadays in US as well. So with all this, aren't we really moving away from what these people wanted us to be?
You mean in terms of how they envisioned the world for us, they had hoped the world would be for us at
Yeah.
this point?
Like, aren't we really moving away from this dream?
You know, I think the world, I think the world and human culture, part of progress, even in my own personal life, you know, it's ebb and flows. You make progress, and then sometimes, you know, you sort of want to sleep in, right? So it ebbs and flows. There are ups and there are downs in everyone's individual life, but most certainly in our lives together as a human culture or a global culture or communities. And so, you know, we have to think about it that way. It's not going to be a direct linear movement where you make progress and the progress is steady or it increases. There are going to be times when you slow down. There may be a couple of steps that you have to take backwards because there's always going to be a give and take. Any kind of change, whether in your personal relationships or in global relationships, social, political relationships, are really about negotiations. And part of negotiating is there is going to be this give and take. And so we see that happening as some people make progress. Other folks say, well, that progress sort of gets in the way of my being able to make progress. So what can I do to either slow that progress down so that I can stay ahead? I mean, there's always going to be this tension between people's intentions. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. But what was incredible about Gandhi as an example of peace to make social change and Martin Luther King is, in spite of the fact that there would be this give and take, they never stopped. They kept moving forward. And the whole idea of using peace and love as forces for change, they never gave up on that. They committed to it. And so I think that's the important thing. Just because you're met with barriers and just because you're met with being pushed back, and even when you have to make incredible sacrifices, don't give up. You have to keep pushing forward, sort of like winning a race. You'll get tired, you know, your bones and your muscles may ache, but you can't win the race if you quit.
Thank you, sir. So Bryant would like this to be an interactive session. He has planned it like that. So the session is now open for discussion. Over to you.
Good morning, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, sir. Fine.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is, could you differentiate between what is racism and casteism? Is there any difference between these two terms? Another thing is, in 2001, when the World Racism Conference was held in Durban, in South Africa, the India government stated that racism is not a casteism. So they didn't allow the delegates to participate in that conference in 2001. Even now in India, on the basis of caste, discrimination takes place. Many killings are there, ostracization is there, discrimination is there everywhere in India. Why in India, even though untouchability was banned, eradicated through Article 17 of the Constitution, still in India, casteism is a barrier for our growth? My doubt is whether in the whole world we failed in realizing the dreams of Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Mahatma Gandhi of India and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Why when people are getting what is called civilized and civilized on the basis of education and other social living also, why we fail in materializing or their dreams coming true? Why we continuously fail? Why people are discriminated on the basis of caste and race? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that was a lot actually. So I'm trying to figure out how to sort of dissect that. But I think essentially, looking at say King's dream of getting rid of the whole idea of being able to defeat racism and comparing race, and you're comparing racism. How do we look at racism in the context of the caste system? So that's one part of it. But also, so many decades later, even after King's assassination, why does racism and why do these other kinds of isms, including the caste system, still exist? That's a really difficult question, quite honestly, because that's really outside the realm of how I can talk about it. I think it really takes, I've had a number of conversations and even, been a part of public programs dealing with these issues. I would say in the US, for example, I can't really speak to caste here in India, but in the US, there has been a long tradition of different kinds of caste systems, not just race. Gender is another one, and even within gender, but also class. And when you think about people's class and economic status, that has created social hierarchies that exist everywhere around the world. And one of the things that Dr. King wanted to do, say, with the Poor People's Campaign and looking at economic justice was specifically, and how do we address all of these different systems of caste and social hierarchy? Gender. For example, he opened the Poor People's Campaign with a Mother's Day march. And that was really important to him because he wanted to focus on the role that women played in the world and also to take a look at how women were discriminated against and how important the role of women as mothers, raising children, and essentially raising the future of, and generations of futures, quite honestly, all over the world, how that had to be acknowledged. But what we don't talk about in the civil rights movement is how important gender was and was often overlooked as an important subject, and caste, where women are created, where women are put in a place with a certain social hierarchy, even amongst King and his friends in the social justice movement. So it wasn't until the late 1960s that began to change. Then also looking at economic status, I think that's really important as well, because a lot of this is tied to economics, right? Even if we talk about colonialism and imperialism, racism and caste is tied to that as well, because you know, it's about social capital, cultural capital, and all of that ultimately to get economic capital. And so you have to create social hierarchies, you have to create cultural hierarchies in order to maintain your status within an economic system of hierarchies. And so I think when we began to look at all of these different hierarchies through that sort of lens of social, cultural, and economic, we can begin to articulate a little more clearly, you know, what's at the heart of this. But I think all of us understand, as King understood with the Poor People's Campaign, that it's not just about defeating racism or gender discrimination or just class. It's about looking at the economics of all of these different kinds of social hierarchies.
If I can pose a question, Aaron. You know, I've read a lot of Gandhi, not as much of Dr. King. And some of it, what we was talking about, I think the dream, while the starting was probably, you know, reaction to oppression and imperialism and colonialism and discrimination, I think Gandhi had a very fulfilling and encompassing dream of particularly economy. He talked about village economy. The term was Gram Swaraj. And he went on to say, if we don't achieve that in terms of each village being independent units which function self-sustaining and all of that, the devolution of power doesn't happen, we would not have achieved independence in the true sense. He almost went on to say, I would only believe that the color of the skin of the people have changed, and that's all has happened. And he had dreams about education. He almost set up schools in one of the districts where I work, West Champaran, which is incidentally where he started one of his walks of protest. So he had very, you know, not just about independence and oppression and opposing that, but various facets of life. He had dreams about that, how the society should, what should be the education. There is a Gandhian school of thought of education and others and livelihood, how there should be small industries and all of that. So just curious to know what kind of other dreams or, you know, Dr. King had about the American society and economy.
Yeah, thank you for, and I hope everyone heard that, that a lot of times we begin to associate a certain leader or a certain historical figure with this one thing. So we put this single lens on them. And I'm really glad that you talked about some of these other issues that Gandhi was fighting for, because he had a very full and complicated life. He was a complicated human being, but he also understood that independence isn't just about gaining achievements in one area, that it would take many different struggles to overcome in order to reach full equity and to make social progress. So to that point, yes, and Dr. King recognized that as well. During the Poor People's Campaign, for example, education was central to the demands that the poor people marchers were making to the government, that education for all people. At that time, not everyone in the South, for example, in places like Mississippi in particular, could have equal access to education. And so Dr. King wanted, with the Poor People's Campaign, to put legislation in place that would guarantee people would have equal access or access to education, because it was through education that people could learn trades, that they could become teachers and educate other people where they lived, that people could apply for jobs. It's difficult to apply for jobs if you can't read, for example, or you don't know how to write. And so Dr. King, for the Poor People's Campaign, education was really important to him. So was housing, and making sure that folks had adequate housing. So there were a number of issues that he addressed that we rarely talk about, the same as with Gandhi, for example. So thank you for making that point.
Doctor, good morning. I would just ask you to throw a bit more light on why the ideals of Gandhiji and Martin Luther King is being diluted in today's world. Is it because the society in general is turning a bit more individualistic and thinking inwardly, and it is being that we are thinking of our own progress rather than of the society in general, which entails more sacrifice?
Could you repeat the last part? It's a little hard. It was hard to hear you. Sorry.
What I will say is that society in general is being more individualistic and thinking about our own self rather than about the society, which entails more sacrifice as per Gandhiji's and Martin Luther King's ideals are concerned. And that's why we are nowadays vilifying them and diluting their ideologies.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think it also connects to your question as well. This whole idea that we have individualized our dreams and concerns, and I think the response to that would be similar to how I saw your question, or a response to your question, is that it really is about building a sense of community. And it's only through community that you can create this sense of shared goals as well as common interests. Now, to your point, people are so individualized. We're all living in our cell phones nowadays, and we're always looking. I know that I'm always looking at a cell phone, and people actually connect, particularly certain generations, connect to one another through cell phones. But that doesn't mean that building a sense of community can happen. And again, using even the Black Lives Matter movement in the US as an example, it was through cell phones that all of that protest, that people were able to organize protests and protest so quickly, or come together to create a sense of community, to discuss what their dreams were and how people can achieve common dreams together using a cell phone. So it's very different for us today in terms of how people connect, but people are still connecting. And so we have to be able to use those tools, I think, to reach one another. I'm not as adept on social media, but I do have my ways of making friends, getting to know people, and building a sense of community. And I can still do that. For my mom, it's about houses of worship. So my mother builds community. My mother is actually the president of a labor union. So she's really good at building a sense of community among people. But one way that she does that is not just going out and knocking on doors and shaking hands, but through her house of worship and building communities that way. And how can we pull our resources together? Well, I may not have a particular house of worship, but my neighbor might. So then can I convene with my neighbor and we can figure out what resources they have that we can pull together to make whatever change or achieve whatever dreams we'd like to achieve together.
So, Martin Luther King has underscored the famous quote of Thomas Jefferson that all men are created equal. Coming to Trump's America, where he disregards the transgender community and declared that only true success are there in America. How do you visualize the Martin Luther King's America and Trump's America? How do you see? What's the change going to happen?
It's hard. It would be hard for me to assess that, quite honestly, because I'm not so sure they're so different. People evolve, but we don't necessarily always change. And so you always have the same kinds of obstacles to deal with in many ways, no matter what period of time it is. So it would also be hard for me to make that assessment because I'm living now and I know what my experiences are like now, but it's hard for me to talk specifically about those experiences outside of an academic or intellectual, I've read this and studied this kind of way. But I think your question is not about that. It really is sort of, to a great degree, my parents, how would they see, I would pose this question to my mother, for example. How would she see the 1960s and what her life was like then compared to what life is like today? One thing that I would say is that people have resources and opportunity to make change. Because during my mother's time, during the 1950s and 60s in the South, growing up in South Carolina in the US, she didn't have a platform. She couldn't really speak out. One, because she was a woman, and what the expectations would be of her during that time in the South, particularly a young woman, and also because she was African American in the South. But today, my mother's the president of a labor union, right? So if I looked at that as an example, I would say, regardless of what people have to deal with in their time period, we're at least in a place where we can stand up and speak out and take matters into our own hands. That life doesn't just have to happen to us, that we can orchestrate our own lives. And if things don't move in the direction that we agree with, we're free to stand up and speak out. And then again, through social media, I am a proponent of, building community. Social media has made it so easy to build community, so you don't have to stand up alone. You don't have to go knocking on doors in secret anymore. You can just take the social media, and tomorrow, 100 people, we're going to go downstairs, we're going to go downtown, and we're going to protest. So I think about it in that context, but ultimately the simple answer to your question is, when my mother was in this, growing up in the 60s, she couldn't speak up and was expected to not speak up. And today she leads a labor union.
Good morning. Further elaborating on the last question, in this era of expansionist politics and right-wing politics, do you really see a hope for the peaceful coexistence of the world?
Oh, I'm sorry, what was the question?
In this era of right-wing and expansionist politics by the leaders, do you really see a hope for the peaceful coexistence of the world?
Is this a question about peace in the future? Oh, wow, that was the shortest question and probably the hardest answer. And I'm going to blame it on being such a brief question. Yeah, that's a really tough one. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to open up this conversation, right? I didn't want it to be about me speaking, because some of the questions you have, I also have. And I'm just wondering, is there anyone out there who might be able to answer that question? It's almost like, is there any hope for peace in the future? And I would add to that, and how does it happen? And that's a difficult one for me, but I would say part of the conversation, and the reason I say we have to open it up, is because it kind of takes all of us to put our heads together, to communicate, to talk about this, in order to come up with those kinds of solutions. So would anyone like to actually tackle that one while I think about how I might respond? Well, I would say it's a combination of some of the other things I've already talked about. One, I think persistence is one. If we look at, say, Gandhi and King as examples, they made considerable sacrifice. And to your earlier point about we have individual dreams, it's harder to, and your point as well, I think it's harder to get people to make that kind of sacrifice today. But we can all make some sort of sacrifice. And I think it has to begin there. But in terms of ever achieving world peace, that's a really difficult one. And as soon as I come up with the answer, I want my Nobel Prize, quite honestly. And in the meantime, please think about that. And you don't even have to have an answer today, but I think that's important for us to think about, even as we go on with our lives after this session.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Nowadays, the grassroots people are misled by the present leaders. They are diluting the values of Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi. What is the solution for that? Grassroots people are the mass. The mass are simple. Their values are being diluted. by the present leaders?
Well, and in many ways too. I mean, it's popular culture, and in some ways, our dreams are no longer just tied to social progress. We don't see social progress as a community happening necessarily through popular culture. So I would say, in all kinds of ways, we're sort of being misled about what our dreams should be. But to your point, and I think your point as well, as part of that is because through education or even through lack of education, we really don't understand the complexity of these histories and these people we talk about. In the US, for example, Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream," is probably one of his most well-known dreams. But it wasn't until I started studying King that I realized that that dream is a lot more radical than what we hear. Everyone is familiar with, "I have a dream that one day Black children and white children will, play together," that kind of idea. But what people don't hear is the part of the speech particularly towards the end, where Dr. King is making demands for economic justice. He's very specific about the economic justice behind it. And he says, "America has written a check and today we're here to cash it." That kind of thing. So it was a really radical speech, but we don't learn that part of the speech. So yeah, the way we're taught about these leaders and we're taught this history is very different. But that's not really on any institution necessarily, because we also have an obligation to teach our children and to teach ourselves, through libraries. We can do our own research. Even all of the information and all that I learned during my dissertation, I would have never known. I didn't know anything about the Poor People's Campaign when I started doing the research. I just happened to meet an older gentleman who was a photographer, and he showed me all of these photographs. And when I asked him what it was, and here again, this is really important. I was a young student, and this guy was a photographer in his 70s. I ran across some of his photos, and he took it upon himself to teach me about the Poor People's Campaign. And then from there, I decided I wanted to learn more, and I went out and I did the research. To that point, that's how it really happens. It wouldn't be taught in schools. We have to sort of teach each other. The elders in the community have to teach the young, and you have to inspire the interest for the young to learn more and to learn more about the subject. And today, because that older gentleman, the elder in my community, took time to work with me, I'm here in India talking about the Poor People's Campaign. And some of his photographs are on exhibit. And this has been happening now. I've been studying the Poor People's Campaign since about 2008. So, again, it's about commitment and steadfastness, but more importantly, we have to teach each other and not necessarily rely on institutions.
But nowadays, more of teaching is neglected, actual teaching. Hello?
Okay.
Nowadays, this teaching is misguided. Misguide the simple thoughts of the common man. They get misguided by the values are diluted for their selfishness, like leaders, present leaders. The present leaders, in the pretext of teaching the values, they misguide the common, simple people. Supposing I'm following Gandhi or Dr. King, they try to, they try to misguide you.
No,
For that selfish interest.
Yeah, I think I understand
to gain power, they do it for elections and all.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. And again, my response would be the same. That you can't rely on institutions, because institutions really, we can't expect them to do the things for us that we are demanding other. We can't expect to absolve ourselves of doing the things that we're demanding other people to do for us, right? So that goes back to my point about if you feel that youth is being misguided or miseducated, and this was something in the U.S. with African Americans. As a matter of fact, the founder of Black History Month, Carter G. Woodson, became famous for writing a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And he then began Black History Month specifically. It started out as Black History Week. He started it specifically as a time for people in their communities to teach Black history to their children so that they didn't rely on the education system. And eventually becomes Black History Month, and then it becomes a museum movement and a library movement where people begin to build museums and libraries specifically to teach communities about a specific subject so that we didn't have to rely on institutions. So my response to that would be the same, is that doesn't absolve us of doing the hard work of educating ourselves. We have to do that, no matter how good the education system is or may not be.
Hi, I'm just curious about how Martin Luther King reacted to
Who's saying that? Oh,
yeah,
Steps,
sure.
yes.
I was just curious how Martin Luther King reacted to Gandhi's religion. From what I know, Gandhi was very much influenced. Gandhi was very much influenced by the Bhagavad Gita, that you're your deep inner self, that you're not your mind-body complex. So I just wonder that how did he react to Gandhi's sense of religion? Was he an exclusivist that no, your religion is wrong, it's only mine is right? Was he an inclusivist who said, we're both right, but I will understand you in my terms? Or was he a pluralist? Did he try to change himself in some way after seeing Gandhi practice his religion?
Well, actually, thank you for the question. Actually, Dr. King talks a lot about Gandhi in the context of Christianity. And part of the reason he wanted to use Gandhi in this photo was specifically to sort of make a point to Christians who call themselves Christians. Essentially, it's not enough to call yourself a Christian and to go to church and to do those things, but you have to practice and you have to live the principles of Christianity, even as they're practiced outside of Christianity. So it all basically comes down to having a sense of peace, faith, and love, maintaining hope, faith, and love. And so when he writes about Gandhi, he often talks about how Gandhi practiced what would be the principles of Christianity better than most Christians that he knew, making the point that if these are the rules that we're supposed to use to guide our life, whether they're Christian or some other religion, quite honestly, then Gandhi is living an example of that we can all follow regardless of what religion we happen to be. And he writes about that pretty extensively, and he even gives sermons about it, and published essays in magazines as well as books about it as well.
Hi, good morning. Here, hello. You able to hear me?
Yeah, just move it a little closer.
Okay, this is better? Yeah. So, just looking at some of the questions, talking about, like he said, it's being misled, the youth or the masses, or like that lady asked about, can we see world peace? Just thinking out loud, is it because you think it's a natural human tendency that we turn to violence, it's an easier option? Is it in our psyche that that's lead to us? Or a peaceful solution or meditation, that kind of things are more harder and our mind doesn't quickly adapt to it. So could that be a solution moving towards that. It's going against our natural tendency, doing hard work, thinking out loud, and then moving towards it.
Yeah, well, to your point, I think it is a lot more complicated. So when you do ask questions about world peace, every single person in this room could have a different response to that. And the same thing about education. Each person could have a different response to that question as well. And that's why I say it's so important for us to get together and to form communities, because no one person has the answer. And something like world peace, or how do you correct education, or how do you teach people a certain way, or teach them certain things, again, each one of us will have different ideas about what those things would be. So it takes a community. They say it takes a village to raise a child, right? It takes a village to make social change, because we all will have different ideas and different ways of achieving those things. So it takes all of us together, bringing those ideas together in order to make the change we're looking for. Because you can't have just one person saying, this is world peace, this is how we're going to get it, now go. It really does take all of us. And the same thing with how do we educate our children. And again, I really am a proponent. My parents spent a lot of time teaching me outside of school. And that's why I ended up getting my doctorate, quite honestly, because I was hungry for learning more outside of what my teachers were teaching me. And I think it's important that we all do that. I'm as old as I am, I like to maintain a sense of youth. I've never lost that sense of discovery, to learn more. You can never know too much about a subject. And the more I learn, even about the Poor People's Campaign, the more I realize, the less I know. So it's an ongoing process of learning, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and with that, we'll be ending the session.
Thank you for sharing this amazing photograph with us. It's not among the iconic photos of Martin Luther King or Gandhi that are circulated. So as an anthropologist, I'm sorry, I'm steering towards a much smaller topic. I'm interested in the production of this photo. So from what you've been sharing, it seems like King and the photographer Fitch collaborated to compose this.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that discussion between them and how this photo was put together?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And wow, that's exciting. Yeah, I'm a visual anthropologist, so I always love my intervention in this photograph. Actually begins with the whole idea of anthropology. I was really interested in really the same question, and thinking about, so what's on the desk, and why is that on the desk, and what does that have to do with anything? And like I said, I had the opportunity to speak with the photographer just, maybe a few years before he passed away. And he talked about the fact that this wasn't even King's office, for example. King's office was a bit more cluttered. And so he wanted to produce an image that was simple, and so that everything that was in the image itself would be things that were important to King and communicated where he was in his life at the time and what his thinking was at the time. And so they ended up moving, I think this is actually the whole way outside of King's office. They ended up moving a desk out there and the phone and some of the other things you see there on the desk. And I can't remember, but I think they put up the photograph of Gandhi, and it might have been like one of those things they did at the last minute, and it could have been even a conversation of, oh, so what do we put on the wall? Well, why don't you put up that, do you have a photograph of Jesus? He's like, no, let's put up a photograph of Gandhi. I mean, do you have a painting or an image of Jesus? Well, no, let's put up an image of Gandhi instead. And so they talked about what that meant and what that would communicate. And part of it would be that controversy that King is a Christian minister who had on his wall someone who wasn't an icon or even a figure that most Christians were familiar with. And so King really wanted to communicate a strong message with that. And that's also why it's the only thing that's on the wall. And so the things that are on the desk are just to make it feel like an office, but really what they wanted to do was strip down the photograph so that essentially it's just King with Gandhi. And then the things that they ended up putting on the desk. So this is, this is a different photo. There were two photos. There were two photos, and they're each a little different, but they selected books, and I think the books in this photo are the same. They selected books that communicated something very specific that was important to King. One was a story about interracial love, so the races coming together, and then others on like African American history, and so that's essentially what's there. There are a number of things that, if you look into it, like why do you have a Rolodex there? So it speaks to the importance of resources, for one, and networks and resources, but also to make it look more like an office as well. But ultimately, I think when it came down for King and Bob Fitch's, they just wanted King with an image of Gandhi, but they had to make it look like an office so as to not make that so obvious.
Okay, thank you, sir. So hereby we are ending the session here. So I thank all of you who have gathered here for this session, and thank you, Dr. Bryant, for this wonderful session here. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron Bryant and Alaka Narayanan, for their discussion on Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and their relevance in today's world.